All the paintings in the exhibition were painted around 1960. Now the reason for this is really that was my first enthusiasm and my first introduction to British painting. And it just happened at a moment when there was this sudden flowering of British art. It wasn't really until the 1950s that things began to change and people realised suddenly that there was such thing as modernism and there was such thing as abstract art, which was extremely unpopular in the 1940s. A lot of artists like Scott and Lanyon and Hilton had lost something like 6 years because they were in the army or in services, or conscientious objectors refusing to do military service like Patrick Heron and Brian Winter. And this meant that they only really began to come to their maturity rather later than usual, and they overlapped a younger generation. And that, I think, was what was so interesting in the 1950s, that you got really a generation of artists who were already in their late 30s, mid-30s, late 30s, the same time as younger generations. Now, the older generation I got to know partly through the contacts I made by my visits to St Ives, and this led me into a very close friendship really with particularly Peter Lanyon and Patrick Heron, but also Roger Hilton and William Scott, who was a regular visitor, and Terry Frost, who moved to St Ives. And these painters, as I've said, that was one generation. They did call themselves the middle generation at one point, but that was a bit unfortunate, I think, because it made them look as though they were already something a bit antiquated. Anyway, in London, the same sort of thing happened with a group of painters who were also of the same generation, sometimes a bit older, like Kerry Richards, the Welsh painter, and Alan Davey, the Scottish painter. William Scott came from Northern Ireland. Now there you are, over 10 years you have an extraordinary group of painters. And I think this is what lent such vitality to this particular moment of British art, because you had side by side a whole group of thrusting new painters, all competing for attention, all doing what may well be the best work they ever did in the next few years. I've found writing about these artists led me to feel I must get to know them better and visit their studios and talk to them. And so I seem to, looking back, I seem to have slowly shifted away from writing art criticism to writing about artists for their exhibitions, and then making exhibitions myself and with other people. And this became a very important part of my life in the early 60s particularly. I made a very large exhibition at the Tate with Lawrence Gowing called 54-64 Painting and Sculpture of a Decade. Not an easy title to remember. But this was an attempt to do the kind of thing that Roger Fry had done just before the First World War with his post-impressionist exhibitions, but to do the same sort of thing on an international scale, showing side by side British art of this new thrusting generation with American art on the one hand and European, mainly French or Parisian art on the other hand. And I think this exhibition in 1964 was quite an important statement really, and quite helpful to the British artists who had to measure themselves against the international competition. I would say there were probably about 30 British artists in 54-64, matched with 30 Americans and 30 Europeans. And at least half the artists in 54-64 came to be in my collection. I had this feeling that I wanted to live with the paintings to understand them better. I think it's a very natural reaction. I started off by buying prints, lithographs, which all I could afford at that time, but then a bit later on I was able to acquire some pictures. Many of the pictures in the exhibition are actually gifts from artists, sometimes because I was helping them, writing about them, for example, making a book about them. And artists are very generous, so this was very nice for me. And living with paintings actually is, if you can, is a wonderful experience, I think, because somehow or other it means more if the actual physical object is with you. I'm afraid I have a very elitist view about art and music, which I like to hear my music live in concerts, and I like to have my art live on the wall, and I'm not so keen on reproductions. The paintings that I feel closest to probably are the pictures associated with St Ives. I had this strong feeling for Cornish painting, partly because of my own Cornish connection. This is really why I got on very well with Peter Lanyon, and why I found Peter Lanyon's work, perhaps of all the paintings that I've lived with, it's Lanyon's pictures that I do feel closest to. Peter had this very strong feeling that he wanted to know the landscape as much as he could. He used to travel around it on motorbike and walking and motor car. And paintings like Boulder Coast, for example, which Boulder Coast is the wonderful road that goes from Land's End to St Ives. And it goes through all the tin mining area of St Just, but it also goes past cliff castles like Boss Castle and very close to ancient monuments like the Quoints and the Menantol, for example, which is this prehistoric monument on the moors of Cornwall. And all this meant a great deal to Lanyon, as it does to me, because I've always felt, as he did, that our forebears have always lived there, and that's quite an interesting feeling to have. I think it gives you an identity with the land itself. The other painters I particularly liked from St Ives were Patrick Heron. Patrick really became a very close friend. He was an intellectual among painters. He could write, and he could express himself. A lot of painters find it quite hard to express themselves in words. Why should you expect them to? William Scott, for example, was very, very modest in his own talk. And that was what made writing about William so interesting, because you had to create a language which somehow expressed the painting. Patrick Heron, though, could do that himself. But he had, I think, a wonderful feeling for just plain colour. That's what comes through in the pictures of Patrick's, which I've lived with. Other artists like Roger Hilton. Roger was a very difficult man, as I think everybody knew. I loved Roger and admired him and liked his painting, but one has to say, he didn't promote his career very satisfactorily, I would say, on the one hand. But something of that sort of difficult quality, I think, is in his paintings. They're not at all easy paintings. They have a kind of subterranean, under the surface feeling of the figure in particular, and there's a kind of erotic quality in Roger's pictures which I rather like, actually. I think it gives it a particular colouring, and because they are difficult pictures, they take a lot of living with, and you have to take them quietly. They don't appeal immediately as a lot of art does, but perhaps because of that reason I always liked his pictures. Other artists who were their contemporaries, a bit younger perhaps, like Richard Hamilton and Bacon, of course, who was there, this great figure in the background, they never meant so much to me that I wanted to own them. Even Aardvark and Kossoff, whose work I admired, didn't directly appeal to me somehow. One has to accept there is this difference between one's own personal taste and a more objective view. I've always tried to cultivate them both, being objective in my appraisal of the whole area and realizing that there were certain things that were more important for me. And I have to recognize I have a kind of puritanical dissenting background, and though I like fairly monochromatic pictures and emotions hidden in the paintings, not obvious on the surface, and colours that are not too contrasted. I think you can see that from the pictures in the exhibition. I think the most important thing to say to anybody is be prepared to spend time looking at pictures. I do get slightly worried sometimes the speed with which people make judgments about art, because my own experience was that only by being prepared to spend a great deal of time just looking can you really form any objective judgments. My looking started in the Fitzwilliam. When I was an undergraduate, I used to pop into the Fitzwilliam, which was a very quiet place in the early 1950s, and just to look at pictures and spend time looking at pictures. This was how I got to know the director at the time, Carl Winter, who I suppose noticed that I was always hanging around. And it was Carl who told me that I ought to go to the Courtauld Institute. But I think with contemporary art, I mean, the justification for flaunting my judgments about contemporary art is really that I have spent hours and hours and hours just going around exhibitions, looking and looking and looking. That's what you have to do, because you build up a kind of unconscious head full of the art that you're looking at, and this does help you to make discriminatory judgments. I don't think I've invited any artworks into the house that I couldn't live with. My wife is a triplet, and when we started having children, her gynecologist said, you better find yourself a big house because you're quite likely to have a large family. We bought a house that had been 3 flats put together. But of course that did mean we had a lot of wall space, and that was very nice. And that's really when we filled the house up in the 60s. And then things have hardly changed since. A few additions and changes. But otherwise the paintings have been more or less stable for 50 years. Occasionally I bought things at auction sales, and I found in the 70s, for example, that nobody wanted these early abstract pictures by Roger Hilton or William Scott's Cornish landscape, and for that reason I was able to buy them for very, very little money. Then I had a pension fund when I left the Tate Gallery, when I had to retire when I was 60 in 1988. And I used that pension money to buy 1 or 2 pictures that I had long loved and that turned up, like my blue Scott's Still Life. And that's really how the collection came together. I rather hate the fact that prices are attached to artworks. Poems don't have values, they can exist in a non-commercial state. And I've always felt slightly embarrassed at the values that are now given to some of the pictures that I own. So I thought some time ago that I would like to give them back to the Fitzwilliam, which had meant so much to me, and that they would make a nice compact group of work done around the 10 years from 55 to 65, and they could be added to the documentation and the books that I was giving. I'm giving my art library to the University Library at Cambridge, and I thought this would make quite a strong research facility for any history of art students in Cambridge who are interested in British art of this period. I think it's one of the great periods of British art looking back, and I think it always will be of serious interest to young scholars. And as I spent so much of my life teaching young scholars, I thought it would be nice that all this material, both the documentation and the artworks themselves, should be available. And I think some of the pictures, I hope visitors to Fitzwilliam, I know space is cramped, but I hope future will see the Fitzwilliam expanding, and there will be this collection to draw on.